Good morning. Welcome to the third in a five-part series of webinars dealing with the prosecution, defense, treatment, and community supervision of adult and juvenile sex offenders. My name is Harriet Dickerson, and I'm an administrative specialist at the Administrative Office of the Courts and moderator for today's webinar. There are offenders who engage in illegal sexual acts who are not ultimately classified as Megan's Law. In this series of webinars, we'll explain how all these cases, both Megan's Law and non-Megan's Law cases, are processed through the New Jersey judicial system. This series was developed through a partnership between the New Jersey Judiciary's Division of Probation Services and the New Jersey Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers, or NJATSA, who funded this project. We are very grateful for the support we received from all the participating agencies, including the New Jersey Office of Public Defender, the New Jersey Division of Child Protection and Permanency, or DCP&P, the Camden County Prosecutor's Office, and the Union County Prosecutor's Office. Our goal is to provide stakeholders and the general public an opportunity to learn how sex offender cases are processed. It will include information on case disposition options used by the prosecutor and the defense attorney, treatment options and how reunification with the family is handled in cases of incest, the role that DCP&P plays in these cases, and the differences between how juvenile and adult sex offenders are handled in the justice system and why. This webinar today is approximately 1 hour and 30 minutes long, which includes a 20-minute time slot to take questions from the audience through the GoToWebinar website. Within 2 weeks of this live webinar, this session will be posted on the NJATSA website for ongoing access by both stakeholders and the public. Today's webinar topic is Division of Child Protection and Permanency, DCP&P, and Treatment. Natasha Cranmer and Thomas Farrell from the DCP&P will discuss how to make a referral, what to expect when you call the hotline, steps taken when a referral is received, and services provided to victims, offenders, and families affected by sexual assault. Dr. Hiscox and Dr. Bosley will discuss evaluations and treatment for individuals focusing on juveniles with sexual assault charges. We will now start our presentation with Ms. Kramer and Mr. Farrell. Good morning, Natasha and Tom.
Good morning.
Natasha began her career with the Division of Child Protection and Permanency in 2000 and is currently a case practice liaison. Tom currently works at the NJ Child Abuse Hotline, where he has served as an assistant administrator, caseworker supervisor for the last 11 years.
Thank you. Good morning. To start, I just want to go over the first slide. So this is our general DCP&P presentation. The first few slides, if this one are coming. It just talks about the mission anyway, which I'll just say as we're getting ready. So the main mission for DCP&P is to, in partnership with New Jersey communities, to ensure safety, well-being, and success of families in New Jersey. There we go. Okay. So the first slide, which talks about our mission, there are 5 little boxes below, and these are basically the 5 largest divisions within DCP&P: Child Protection and Permanency, Adolescent Services, Children's System of Care, Family Community Partnerships, and Division of Women. What we're really going to be focusing on is mainly what DCP&P is dealing with and what you have to know in terms of reporting abuse and neglect. So let's go on the next one. Okay. So in New Jersey, everyone's considered a mandated reporter. And what that basically means is that anyone with any suspicion of abuse and neglect is required by law to call it into the hotline. The next slide, which we'll get to in a second, will actually explain what the law says about that. All allegations do have to come through the New Jersey Child Abuse Hotline. In other words, if you are working with, say, a caseworker on an open DCP&P case and new allegations are found, you would still be required to call the hotline and not simply provide it to the caseworker. Go to the next one. So the very first bullet point talks about state law NJS 9. So what you'll typically hear DCP&P workers, you'll hear us talk about Title 9 and Title 30 quite a bit. Title 9 is the actual statute that gives us the authority to investigate abuse and neglect. It gives us the authority to speak to a child without parental permission. And it also gives us the authority to do a removal if we feel that there's imminent risk and the child's safer not being with the parents. So Title 9 is what gives us all the access and all the authority that we have. And it also basically says that that's the law that requires anyone to make a report if they have any suspicions of abuse and neglect. In terms of reports that you make, anyone who makes a referral is pretty much immune from any kind of civil or criminal liability, with the exception that you're making that call in good faith. There could be a penalty incurred if there's repeated false allegations made against the family, but for the most part, you are free of any kind of liability if that's made in good faith. On top of that, if you make a referral and it's investigated and turns out to be unfounded, there's no consequence or any kind of repercussions for the person who made that referral. Again, granted that the referral was made in good faith. Nextly, for not reporting abuse and neglect, there is a potential fine of up to $1,000 and 6 months imprisonment if it becomes known that a person had knowledge of reported abuse and neglect and did not report that to the division. There could be serious consequences. And for professionals, it's duly important because as mandated reporters, you can possibly lose your licensure, your certification, your position. So it's just not something we should all be messing around with. You need to make a referral immediately. So defining abuse and neglect. So we take this, basically piecing it together from the definition that comes from the law. So for abuse in New Jersey is to be considered physical, mental injury, sexual abuse, or negligent treatment by a person responsible for the child's well-being. That is essentially what gives DCP&P our jurisdiction, that the person who's accused of the abuse and neglect is in a caretaking role. What this means is the omission, the commission, or both of an act which places a child at substantial risk of harm. So that's the most basic definition, and from that we also have a slew of other categories which we're going to get into right now. So next slide. So in terms of the referral process, what you need to know. So when you make a referral to the hotline, you're going to be speaking to a screener on the other line. The screeners are trained social workers. They're trained in child abuse and neglect. They're trained in trying to ascertain as much information as possible, as quickly as possible. And they're going to be basically hitting you with a number of about 20 questions at minimum to try and determine what kind of allegation we're looking at. The information is taken by the screener, and we try to make a decision based on the information provided. If the information provided warrants an actual state investigation or a state assessment. And whether or not we do send somebody out, because not all cases end up having an investigation or an assessment, every call that comes in is still documented and kept internally in our system. So the child abuse and neglect, the way it works in terms of definitions is we have what's called the allegation-based system. This is a complex and complicated system of definitions that literally defines abuse and neglect per category. So there are 4 main categories, which would be physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and neglect. And then each of those categories has a number of different subcategories. So for the context of this particular conversation, sex abuse, for example, has sexual exploitation, sexual molestation, sexual penetration, risk of harm because of someone being a perpetrator of past sexual abuse. There's a number of different categories. For physical abuse, there's cuts, bruises, head injuries, wounds, dislocations, fractures. For neglect, there's inadequate supervision, there's medical neglect. So in other words, we just have all these very, very clear definitions of each category. So what's happening at the time of a call, as the information's coming in, and we're trying to see if what's being presented fits into one of those categories. And if it does, we have an automatic abuse and neglect referral and an allegation therefore. If it does not, we're trying to figure out what's the next best thing to do. So when you're making the phone call, these are the really important things that we need to have, the details. Most importantly would be the first one, the who. This is what I would call the real pedigree information. So what we're looking for is accurate spellings, names, addresses, phone numbers, dates of birth, if you have social security numbers, any identifying information. Because what's happening is when the call comes in, screeners are immediately looking into our computer system to try and identify if we already are familiar with this family. And that can affect the outcome of the case. The what. So the what is going to be exactly what it is that you're concerned about. Is it a specific incident that happened? Is a number of incidents that have happened over a period of time? Was there direct disclosure? Is it something you overheard? We want to get a really good description of whatever the information is to the best of your knowledge. So what type of abuse and neglect, we're going to be trying to zero in. If you're reporting about sexual abuse, we're not going to be trying to ask about things that are completely unrelated like medical neglect. We're going to be focusing in on the sexual abuse topic. We want to know how often it's happening. We also want to know when you learn about this. It's very common in particular sex abuse cases that we're getting the information much, much later than it actually happened because they're typically coming out in a disclosure with a therapist. So we want to know, are we talking about something that happened just yesterday, 5 years ago, 3 weeks ago? We want to have an idea of when this actually occurred. The where helps us determine jurisdiction. Is this something that's going to be investigated in a home and out of home setting? DCF has 2 investigating bodies, DCP&P and IIU, and they do different functions because IIU investigates things that happen in areas such as foster homes, group homes, residential centers, schools, where there's an out-of-home setting. So it's very important to know exactly where the abuse actually took place. Where the child is now, we want to know if there's any kind of risk to the child right now, if they need medical attention. Where the alleged perpetrator is can greatly affect how quickly we respond. If an alleged perpetrator still has access to a child, we're going to be responding most likely in an immediate fashion as opposed to within 24 hours. And then the bottom one talks about how. So how urgent is the need for intervention? And that's exactly what we're talking about. Is that we're talking about a child who's injured right now and needs medical care, or is this something that happened several months ago, several years ago, and there's some ability to delay the response? And then lastly, there's a question that says, is there a likelihood of danger for the caseworker? That's just so that we know everything we can about the family before we send somebody out. Our workers are generally going out on their own or maybe with a buddy, been walking into some very volatile situations. So in terms of who will investigate, again, if the alleged abuse happened in the home setting, so we're talking family members, that's going to be DCP&P. And what that means is that an allegation will be sent to a local office in the county where it occurred, and an investigator from that county will respond. If the abuse happened in an out-of-home setting, whether it be a foster home, a school, a group home, a bus company, a camp, same principle applies. Wherever the event actually occurred, or the incident occurred, whatever county, then the IIU office that covers that county will be conducting the actual investigation. Lastly, if a report is made after hours, so from 5 p.m. until 9 a.m. the following morning, it may warrant an immediate response, which goes to our special response unit or emergency workers, and they're the ones who are going out in the middle of the night and going out after hours, generally by themselves. Okay. Finally, so sexual abuse, what is sexual abuse? So this is also taken right from the law, and I'm not going to read it to you, but what I want to make a point of is the difference for DCP&P between a sexual assault and sexual abuse is that abuse is happening at the hands of a caretaker. So if a neighbor, for example, lures a child into their home and commits some type of an act on them, sexual act, that's an assault because they're not a caretaker. If it's a father, an uncle, an adult sibling, they are considered caretakers. So that's what gives us our jurisdiction. So again, the main differentiation between assault and abuse is at the hands of an actual identified caretaker. And this can include a number of different acts. It doesn't have to be any kind of physical touching. It could be taking pictures of the child. It could be forcing the child to pose. It could be showing the child pictures, unrobing or disrobing in front of the child, forcing a child to watch these different acts. So my point being that there doesn't need to be a direct physical act onto the child. There could be other incidents that actually still be considered sexual abuse for a caretaker. That's it for me. And then lastly, so this just talks about a little bit about some of the signs of sexual abuse, which I think we'll probably be getting into later. Very difficult to in one slide, identify sexual abuse. But as you can see on the slide, there are a number of different things to pay attention to. Difficulty sitting or walking, pain or itching in a general area. One of the major ones for us, for children, is an unusual knowledge of sexual activity. In other words, there are certain terms that 3-4-year-olds should not know that adults will be using, and that could be indicative of them being exposed to some level of sexual abuse. That is all from me, I believe. Yes, thank you.
Thanks. Sometimes our agency receives reports of child-on-child sexual abuse. Child-on-child sexual abuse is an act of sexual abuse by one child towards another and implies that there's an existence of power that one child has over another, or that one of the children is in a caregiver role. If two children are engaging in inappropriate sexual acts and one does not have power over the other and is not a caregiver, our agency may receive the report as a child welfare assessment. And a child welfare assessment is an opportunity for our agency to simply assess whether or not a family needs services. However, during that child welfare assessment, the intake worker would be speaking with the children to determine if either of them had learned that behavior from an adult, in which case a new report may be called in and would be accepted as a Child Protective Services report. We know that sometimes when children engage in sexually inappropriate acts towards other children, he or she has also been a victim of sexual abuse. So whenever we're investigating an allegation of sexual abuse, the intake worker would talk to the alleged child offender to determine whether or not they're also the victim. And again, if they disclose being a victim, a new report would be made. So determining whether or not sexual abuse occurred, as soon as the intake worker receives that report, they will be reviewing the allegations and also looking into our system in order to determine if the family has prior history with us. They will also call the reporter back to ask additional information and ask some clarifying questions. And then as per our memorandum of understanding with the prosecutor's office, they would place a call to the county prosecutor's office and determine who is going to take the lead. If the prosecutor's office determines that they are going to be the agency who takes the lead, the DCP&P worker would observe the interviews that the detective has. Sometimes the prosecutor's office will allow the DCP&P worker to go ahead and begin the interviews, knowing that if a child discloses that sexual abuse did occur during those interviews, a call would be made back to the prosecutor's office, and at that point they may assume the lead. When DCP&P takes the lead, each household member is interviewed individually in an effort to get information from each party without the influence of others. We also hold the interviews in a specific order for those same reasons. So first, the child victim would be interviewed, then other children who reside in the home, then the non-offending caregiver, and then the alleged perpetrator. In order to get a really thorough picture of who this family is and what their circumstances are, collateral information is also gathered from a variety of sources, including the school, the pediatrician, any service providers, if the family is already engaged in any kind of therapy, contact with law enforcement, both local law enforcement, as well as doing CIC checks, and if the parents or adolescents are involved with probation or parole, we would also speak with those individuals. The child victim will also be referred to the Regional Diagnostic and Treatment Center. We have several of them throughout the state, and there are a team of doctors, nurses, and mental health professionals who are experts in identifying and treating sexual abuse. Typically, the doctor there, when they receive a referral, will review our case record and any collateral information we have, interview the alleged victim, and then do a medical evaluation and possibly recommend treatment. For us at the division, safety is always paramount. So throughout the investigation, the intake worker will assess the child's safety using an evidence-based tool called a safety assessment. If at any point a safety factor is identified, and for sexual abuse, the specific indicator is child sexual abuse or exploitation is suspected and circumstances suggest that the child's safety may be an immediate concern. If that factor or any other safety factor is identified, the worker must immediately take action to ensure the child's safety. So we always try to keep children in their own homes with their parents, if at all possible. So we would try to use what we call the safety protection plan to keep the child safe there with their non-offending parent. So some examples of a safety protection plan in a sex abuse case might be to have the alleged perpetrator leave the home, or to have the non-offending caregiver and the children leave the home, and to either have no contact with the perpetrator or supervised contact with the perpetrator. If the safety protection plan can't be put in place with the family, then the last resort would be to remove the child and have the child enter placement. In both of those circumstances, whether a safety protection plan is put in place or a child is removed, the division would have to go to court to ensure we're not impeding on the parents' rights. So in any Child Protective Services investigation, we have to make a finding. There are 4 findings, which you can see on the screen, 4 possibilities. There are 2 tiers for circumstances that do not rise to the level of abuse and neglect. Unfounded means there's no evidence that the child was harmed. Not established means that there is not a preponderance of evidence indicating that abuse or neglect occurred. However, there is evidence to suggest that the child was harmed or placed at risk of harm. There are also 2 tiers for circumstances that do rise to the level of abuse and neglect, which allows the worker and supervisor to look at aggravating and mitigating circumstances when making a decision. There are some circumstances where DCP&P must substantiate, including subjecting a child to sexual activity or exposure to inappropriate sexual activity or materials. Substantiated means that there's a preponderance of evidence indicating that abuse and neglect did occur, either an absolute occurred or aggravating circumstances outweigh the mitigating circumstances. Those individuals who are substantiated perpetrators are placed on a registry, and it could impact their ability to gain employment in certain fields. Established means that there is a preponderance of evidence indicating that abuse and neglect occurred. However, mitigating factors outweigh aggravating factors. Once the investigator determines that a family is in need of services, the case will be transferred to a permanency worker, and the permanency worker will have in-person contact with the family at their home at least 1 time per month to ensure the family is getting the correct services and to assess the children's safety. We believe that families are the experts in their own lives and that they know their families best, and they need to be the drivers of their plan. As you can imagine, this is a stressful time for a family when we're involved and there are allegations of sexual abuse, and there may be multiple agencies involved with the family at one time. It's important that everybody who is involved in the family's life come together periodically to discuss the goals and adjust the plan. So we want to support all the family members through this trying time. For the victim, they will have, as I mentioned earlier, an initial assessment at the Regional Diagnostic and Treatment Center, followed by any recommended treatment, which is typically trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy and continued visits by DCP&P. For the adult perpetrator, we would typically recommend that they have a psychosexual evaluation and treatment recommended as a result of that evaluation. However, it is important to note that if there are pending charges, often the perpetrator's lawyer will not allow them or will recommend that they don't participate in these things until the charges are resolved. For a child who has perpetrated sexual abuse, that child will typically have an assessment at the Regional Diagnostic and Treatment Center if they disclose being a victim. It will also be recommended that they have a psychosexual evaluation and treatment as recommended by those evaluations. Again, if the adolescent or child has pending charges, their attorney will likely recommend that they not participate in any evaluations or treatment until those charges are resolved. If the child is both a perpetrator and a victim, we would rely on the evaluators to help us determine what treatment modality to use. We know that sexual abuse can affect each family member in a different way, so it's important that we at the division, as well as other team members, continue to offer services and support to every household member. So for example, the non-offending parent may have trouble accepting that their partner hurt their child if the alleged perpetrator was a source of financial support and has to leave the home or is incarcerated. There might be financial stress on the family. In cases of child-on-child sexual abuse, the parents may have difficulty supporting one or both children, and siblings may resent the victim for disclosing if they have to go into placement or if the perpetrator has to leave the home. Thank you for your attention, and remember that protecting children is everyone's responsibility.
Okay, thank you. Next up, we have Dr. Sean Hiscox. Dr. Hiscox specializes in forensic psychology and is a managing partner at Somerset Psychological Group in Pennsylvania. I'm sorry, PA in Somerville. He conducts forensic evaluations, provides testimony, and is a consultant in a range of criminal areas for juvenile and adults. Good morning, Dr. Hiscox.
Good morning. Thank you both as well. I'm going to talk about risk assessment with sexually abusive youth. Given the brevity of the presentation, I'm going to talk in very broad strokes, but I'm going to introduce a few concepts that I think are important, certain areas that need to be considered, recidivism rates, and two main broad areas that should be evaluated when conducting these sort of risk assessments, and are important for formulating our conclusions. But first, what should a risk assessment with sexually abusive youth look like? This slide says it all. There's a lot in this slide, but it's all important. The evaluator needs to approach this in a comprehensive way. It needs to be individualized. There needs to be attention given to the risk and needs of that particular youth. It needs to be informed by the empirical research. In my opinion, it should include the use of an empirical risk assessment scale to help guide and structure the evaluator's final judgments. As part of, by doing this, by approaching it that way, we're able to develop risk management and treatment plans. As part of that, as part of that approach, is the risk needs responsivity model, or known as the R&R model. And by including this in your model of doing an evaluation, it ensures that your assessment is structured in a way that ensures important areas are assessed. And to greatly summarize it, and by the way, I should point out that for years now, this approach has been adopted by the Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers as a way to approach and conduct assessments. There's three main prongs. The first one has to do with the risk. It assesses the who in this model. The second prong has to do with what to target for interventions. What are the particular needs of the youth that you've evaluated? And then lastly, and of utmost importance, is how to target the interventions that you think are important. And that's the responsivity piece to this. I think in the last 20 plus years that I've been doing this sort of work, this is an area that we've come to appreciate much better than we did when we started. And it has to do, in terms of what the needs are of this particular youth and how we think we can treat those needs. How can we go about doing it based on the strengths and weaknesses of the particular youth that we're evaluating? For example, is a treatment approach in terms of group versus individual appropriate? We've come to learn that a one-size model doesn't work anymore, and so some youth that we work with are better suited for only individual therapy. Others are better suited for a group, and some are better suited for both. Related to that also is how to deliver the actual treatment. Some youth have learning disabilities and processing issues, and a variety of other issues that make a traditional approach to therapy difficult. So the responsivity piece really focuses on what are the individual needs of that particular youth and how can we achieve our goal in helping them progress through treatment. Related to all this as well is how do we conceptualize risk? A common mistake that I see in the countless reports that I've reviewed over the years is I often see a statement such as this. Joe presents a moderate to high risk, period. We need to know a lot more than that. For example, we need to know to whom do they pose a risk? And for what do they pose a risk for? What sort of behavior? And then under what circumstances? To whom do they pose a risk? To their brother, their sister, to their mother. I did an evaluation last week where the youth presented a risk to his mother. Is it to peer-aged girls or boys at school? And then for what? Based on what the history of this particular youth is, what sort of behavior are they at risk for? Some are more dangerous to the public than others? And then under what circumstances, based on the history, do we think that continued sexual behavior problems are more likely to occur? Poor supervision is one that I see all the time. Putting children in situations where they're babysitting and supervising siblings or neighborhood children at too early of an age. But other circumstances apply too. Does the behavior more likely to happen when they're intoxicated? After or while viewing pornography? This is another one that I see a lot lately. Or in the company of peers. It's beyond the scope of this presentation right now, but the under what circumstances piece is a very critical part of the overall assessment, because it really gets to the family and the environment with which the youth is living. Positive, supportive, capable caregivers who provide good supervision it makes a huge difference. And if that is part of the case that you're dealing with, it allows you to do a lot more things that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. I mentioned earlier that I think as part of an adequate risk assessment in this area, it should include a risk assessment scale used for sexually abusive youth. There are many out there. There are many out there, but I included this slide because this is the most commonly used one, and it is also used internationally. It's the JSOAP, the Juvenile Sex Offender Assessment Protocol 2. It's developed by Robert Prinking and Sue Wright and many years ago. And as I talk more, and if you have a chance to review the instrument, you'll see that some of the things I'm talking about fit nicely in with this instrument. The other benefit of this instrument, and one of the reasons why I think it's so widely used, is not only does it serve as a way to begin the task of assessing risk, it also helps structure treatment and management decisions, and it also gives some attention to recent functioning, which is also another important part in doing the risk assessment. But before moving on, what we know now, which we didn't know many years ago, is the evaluator can't rely solely on a risk assessment scale for sexually abusive youth. They can't hang their hat just on whatever score that they get from it, or using that alone. It needs to be used as a way to guide the assessment and as part of it, but not the sole determiner of what that youth's risk is. A couple other quick points to kind of tie this part together, and I think important just to consider in terms of how we look at risk. Good risk assessments match the level of risk management to the level of risk inherent in that individual. So it's an important point to consider. If we have if we do a good risk assessment and we determine that this youth is a low-risk individual, they need fewer resources than a higher-risk individual. And part of our task as an evaluator is trying to figure out the best way to allocate those resources for a variety of reasons. One of those reasons that people don't consider is that if we evaluate a low-risk offender and make the area that they're actually a higher risk, they're likely going to be placed in situations where they're exposed to a variety of risk management and treatment resources that are appropriate for higher risk youth. What that means for a lower risk youth is they're likely going to be associating with more delinquent and conduct disordered peers. And one of the strongest research findings we've come to appreciate is it's not good for a low risk youth. The more that we can keep that youth away from delinquent peers, the better. It's easier said than done, but it's one of the things that the evaluators try to do, and I certainly try to do that in terms of the decisions I make, particularly in terms of placement decisions. Thanks. Some important things to keep in mind that I think are important to ground evaluators who do this sort of work, and to always keep in mind is that risk assessments can cause harm. Inexperienced evaluators and ones that are not up to date on research, they tend to judge sexually abusive youth as higher risk than they actually are. And there's some other points later that I'll get to that I think are part of that. Another important point is that as an evaluator, information in the report often follows that youth for the foreseeable future. So what we choose to write in terms of the conclusions we make and the language we use, including our summary of the record that we have, which is problematic, which I'll get to in a minute as well, is going to follow that youth often through their adulthood, depending on their situation. And I've seen it, and I know Dr. Bosley has too. We've seen it cause a lot of problems for youth as they progress into adulthood. In terms of reviewing the record, I've seen mistakes repeated over and over in background sections that were started at the beginning of the process. And sometimes it doesn't get corrected, and other times it does much later in the process. But it gets back to the responsibility that an evaluator has when they approach these assessments. Relatedly, evaluators need to be aware of several critical areas to ground their assessment. One of the biggest ones is adolescents are difficult to assess, period. It's my opinion they're harder to assess than adults. Why? Because they're teenagers. They're rapidly growing, they're maturing in all kinds of areas. They present one way, and several months later, sometimes weeks later, they'll present very differently. The best way I can describe it, and this was a term coined by Robert Prentke, is they're moving targets. And that's what makes them different than adults in a lot of ways. And an evaluator needs to know that. So what they're seeing and evaluating in that moment may look a lot different in a short time later. So as part of that, the evaluator needs to keep in mind that experimental and risk-taking in adolescence is normal. And that includes some antisocial behavior and sexual behavior problems. Recent developments in neurocognitive science have shed a lot of light on this as well, and given us some evidence of this. And what we know is that the adolescent brain does not fully mature until their mid-20s, and that's why this instability happens. I have noted at the bottom of that slide an excellent article. If you're interested in this area, I would highly encourage you to read this because it summarizes the research very well, the neurocognitive science, and then puts it in context with what I'm talking about in terms of adolescent development. It's written by Dr. Sternberg and Scott. It's titled Developmental Immaturity, Less Guilty by Reason of Adolescence. I highly recommend that you give it a read. Relatedly, and further, just to really make the point clear, because of their adolescence, criminal behavior is less likely than that of an adult to reflect bad character. Also, as part of being a teenager compared to an adult, teenagers discount future more than adults in ways that way more heavily with short-term consequences of decisions. And that just really gets back to the essence of their unformed nature of their character and immature judgment. The good news is that risk adversity increases with age. So everything I just talked about has to do with adolescence in general. But what I'm saying particularly applies for adolescents who have other compounding effects. And by compounding effects, I mean things that evaluators and clinicians often see. And that is co-occurring issues, like ADHD, substance abuse problems, mood disorders, a variety of other things that, when on board, further compound their mature decision making. And if the evaluator is doing a good job and approaching this from an individualized, comprehensive, risk and needs-based assessment, they're going to pick up these other co-occurring issues, and they need to be treated in addition to the sexually abusive behavior. Okay, another big area to consider is recidivism. And to consider, I mean in terms of grounding the evaluator in terms of the reality of the situation. What is recidivism? We call recidivism base rates or reoffense rates. Before I show the next slide, I'm going to show, briefly summarize some recent research in this area. But before I do that, I want everybody in the audience to think really briefly about what you think, what you would estimate the reoffense rates for sexually abusive youth. Take a couple seconds and think about what you think that would be. Okay, I think you'll be surprised. Dr. Caldwell has done some outstanding research in this area. And in a recent study that he did with over 33,000 juvenile offenders, he found that the average 5-year reoffense rate was just less than 5%. When he parceled out certain studies and only used studies from 2000, he found a recidivism rate of 2.75%. He also did an earlier study with 11,000 sexually abusive youth and found that there was a reoffense rate of 7%. So I think this is likely surprising to a lot of people. It certainly is to the general public. And the reality in terms of what this means and why it's so important to be grounded in this research as an evaluator and in anybody, any professional working with sexually abusive youth, is that if we take 100 sexually abusive youth with mixed risk levels, roughly 5 of them are going to reoffend sexually. They're much more likely to recidivate non-sexual. And in Caldwell's recent study, he found that about 39% of them reoffended non-sexually. But think about that for a minute. Out of 100 sexually abusive youth, roughly 5 of them will reoffend sexually. Okay. Again, given the brevity of this presentation, I want people to focus on 2 main factors when they're evaluating these that are really critical to give attention to. One of them is an antisocial interpersonal orientation, and the other one is sexual deviance. If the sexually abusive behavior is part of one of those 2 main factors, it means certain things in terms of how we're going to structure treatment and management. But these 2 areas, in addition to a number of other ones, as I mentioned earlier, family, the environment that the youth is in, and their recent functioning over the last 6 months, are also important to evaluate and will be part of an assessment. But in terms of thinking about 2 main areas that need to be given attention, these are the 2 areas. So if you have a youth high on antisocial characteristics, you're going to likely find an unstable criminal lifestyle. You're likely going to find prior non-sexual criminal history. You may find a callous, egocentric personality. These issues are part of a conduct disorder. And often with these youth that we see with these sort of problems, the sexually abusive behavior is actually part of that broader conduct disorder, which I'll talk about more in a little bit later. As I mentioned, conduct disorder is likely there, impulsive disruptive behavior problems. Interestingly, some recent research is finding that adverse life experiences are very prevalent in this group as well. They tend to have a lot of what we call ALEs, for example, maltreatment, neglect, abuse, witnessing trauma, witnessing violence, those sort of issues are likely part of this as well. The second area is sexual deviance. If a youth is high on sexual deviance, they likely are going to have prior sex offenses. And what does that mean? That means that there's persistence in terms of their sexual behavior problems and sexually abusive behavior. Persistence is a negative indicator in these situations. And persistence is defined as after being detected and sanctioned for sexually abusive behavior, it continues despite that. Other behaviors that are likely going to be or may be present would be sexual preoccupation and sexually compulsive behavior. Sometimes there's acknowledged interest in coercive sex or sexual interest in children, although that's relatively rare in my experience. But when it's present, it's usually a problem, and it's certainly one that would need to be targeted and treated. To tie these two factors together, and I think about them in terms of the big two factors. Different motivations are part of them, and that will also dictate treatment. So on the next slide, I talk about different motivations. There you go. So as an evaluator, in developing and formulating and making your conclusions, we need to try to determine, was the sexually abusive behavior part of a broader conduct disorder or an antisocial interpersonal orientation? Or was it part of a broader sexually deviant interest pattern? Or both? If it's both, you have a high-risk needs youth. Or the other scenario, which is the best scenario, is that it was an expression of inexperience or sexual naivete that resulted in inappropriate sexual exploration. That is best prognosis, and is one that's routinely seen in my practice. That scenario, it truly represents an isolated, circumscribed incident. It's not part of a broader behavior problem with any other issues. And it can be treated very, very easily. And in some cases, in those situations, the youth does not require any treatment or very little treatment, or simply some brief psychoeducation. Okay, and lastly, depending on that motivation that the evaluator determines, a treatment and management plan is customized around it based on the risk need responsivity model. And that transitions into the treatment aspect of things. Dr. Bosley.
Thank you, Dr. Hiscox. What I'm going to do is discuss some of the issues that are involved in general in treating sexually abusive youth. Next slide, please. Juveniles commit about 35% of all sexual offenses against young children. As a population, they constitute about 25% of the individuals who commit sexual offenses. This means that they're highly overrepresented amongst their small portion of the population, and they commit a lot of offenses for that small portion of the population, which really indicates that we need to address it. It becomes a problem. They use an inordinate amount of resources, family court, probation, parole, etc. And they pose significant policy issues, including whether registration, notification, and the types of incarceration that are normally used for adult offenders is appropriate for this population. There's certainly studies that show that there are wide jurisdictional differences, meaning that in one neighborhood there'll seem to be a lot more offenders than in another neighborhood, and we don't know exactly why that's the case, but there's probably not that it's this kind of behavior is not really located in one neighborhood. It's just really how the neighborhoods handle it and whether it's reported and processed through the criminal justice system. Most common scenarios, a teenage offender with a younger child victim. Often the teenage offender is in a responsible role. They're no more likely to commit, they are more likely to commit these offenses in groups at school, of course, because they do go to school, and against acquaintances. One of the problems that we note is that many of these offenses occur in the afternoon, in that period of time between school and when parents return home, and they get a little bit more adequate supervision. Females comprise a small portion, only 7% of the arrests of juveniles for this kind of sexually abusive behavior. And this population is more likely to self-correct. This is a little bit of a speculation, but we can say that since a lot of these are not detected and not addressed, if they were in fact committing these offenses on an ongoing basis into adulthood, we'd have a lot more people who were engaged in this behavior, which is not the case. So, next slide, please. All right. The early thinking that, did we skip a slide there? Okay. I think there was one. Okay, next slide, yeah. Okay. I'm sorry. Next slide. We seem to be having trouble making the slides change. All right. The early thinking, and I can say with some authority about the early thinking about treating this population because they've been around a long time, but we use the ideas and the things that we learned from adult services and really just transferred them whole to adolescents and juveniles. And what we found in the meantime is that that's not really the case. Juveniles are different. They are different. They have very different motives for engaging in this kind of behavior. I'm going to show you some slides about the recidivism. It's interesting that Dr. Hiscox also showed some of the same research that I'm going to show you. That it's very low and 2.75% in one recent study. There are also very different treatment contexts that need to be considered. One of the things that hasn't been discussed is whether this treatment should occur in the community or in incarcerated settings or secure settings, which is in fact, I think, largely, except for the few juveniles who do in fact pose a continued risk, that we are seeing that treating them in the community is much better, both for them and in terms of using resources. There's a connection with these adverse childhood experiences, the ALEs, that Dr. Hiscox mentioned, that many of these juveniles are emerging from fairly traumatic environments, and in fact a lot of the trauma should focus on that traumatic aspect of their upbringing. That a lot of their behavior is impulsive, not compulsive, meaning that it's more situational and they will engage in the behavior, but it's not something that they would do on an ongoing basis. And only a very small portion of these individuals become the adult offenders that occupy our system resources. Next slide, please. Okay.
We're having a little technical difficulty.
Here's a slide showing a variety of different recidivism rates. As you can tell, the recidivism rates for sexual reoffending are pretty low. We are now usually kind of quoting a figure of around 5% or less, being probably a fairly good average, but we suspect that this might even be lower. If you look, though, the non-sexual recidivism rate, when juveniles do recidivate, usually they engage in other kinds of criminal behavior that come to our attention and can be very upsetting for those who are supervising them, but it's not, thank goodness, the type of sexual recidivism that we're so much more concerned about and much more fearful of. The takeaway from this is the fact that the sexual recidivism rate is very low for this population, and it is for adults also, although we haven't discussed that. Juveniles. The old thinking was that youth and adults are totally culpable for whatever bad behavior they're engaging in. Although the new thinking about this is that we understand that youth's brains are developing, and in fact don't quit developing until their mid or even late 20s on occasion. I currently work in a university setting with youth who've been discovered engaging in sexually offensive behavior, and in fact they are much more similar to juveniles than they are adults, although they are technically over 18 and adults. They in fact function much more like juveniles. We used to think that these youth were bad and they're on a fixed trajectory to be forever criminals, but that's not in fact the case, in that most emerge from such traumatic environments that if you listen to them in interviews, what you discover is you kind of think, no wonder you're in my office, because they emerge from places that are just really quite terrible. The old thinking also was that we would do a one-size-fits-all approach, and many of the programs that I set up in the 80s and in the past were based on the current research at the time, but we have found that in fact that research doesn't hold, and that in fact really the best types of treatment are individualized to meet the specific treatment needs of the juvenile who's sitting in front of us, and not some assumed juvenile who we would think. Also, we used to think that a lot of the process was to create intrapsychic changes within the juvenile, when in fact that changing the juvenile's context, working with the school, the family, and other collaterals actually can be much more effective and much more immediate in terms of intervening in this. Major issues in treatment: these individuals are still developing. They're not fixed as they are. They're not fixed as we see them. They're still trying to figure out how they fit in the world and what's going on with them. The treatment should be based on their assessed needs and their vulnerabilities. And we need to also assess what protective factors, what is their environment? Do they have a healthy environment that they're living in? Do they have people who will provide decent adult supervision? Certainly we need to look at the types and severity of the traumatic events in this person's life, because that will have a big impact on just their ability to trust others, their ability to interact in a socially appropriate way. And we also need to look at the treatment interfering factors. These are the kinds of things that interfere with the child's or the adolescent's ability to kind of interact with us as caregivers. Often they're so involved in and really kind of overwhelmed by the other aspects of their life that they really have a very difficult time in terms of connecting with and establishing some kind of change through treatment. We need to consider the context. That's incredibly important, because many emerge from such negative contexts, negative environments, negative lifestyle, that why they're there is really quite clear. They just come from such a bad place. Okay. Major issues in treatment: no standard one-size-fits-all regimen actually works, and this is the marker of kind of the biggest single change in what's happening in our understanding of treatment for youth who sexually abuse, is that the old notion of just, we have a program, you've got to go through the program because everybody goes through the program, doesn't work. It's not really the most efficient way to provide this service. The tasks are to develop self-management skills, help the youth to kind of figure out how they're going to live cooperatively with others, support them in a positive self-image. And this is a kind of a tricky issue, because if the youth has gone through the criminal justice system and been labeled as a sex offender, which they often weighs very, very heavily on them, it's hard for them to have a positive self-image. They think of themselves as they're in the process of trying to find out who they are as a person, develop some sense of identity, and you don't want to say, yeah, we know your identity, all it is a sex offender, because it's really very negative. And support them in their opportunities for positive socialization, to have good peers, to have thinking peers, to have socially positive peers. We want to counter the criminal thinking and defeatist attitudes that often occur if the youth grows up in an environment where being, a criminal or having that kind of criminal lifestyle is looked up to and prized. The criminal is the youth is going to say, well, that's what I should be doing, or try to fit in that environment, which is very negative in the long run. So it's better to kind of not do that. And part of that is aggregating them with other delinquents. If you take a relatively low risk offender, like Dr. Hiscock was saying, and you put him in a incarcerated setting with very high risk delinquents, the potential is that you'll help this poor young person to actually be much worse, which is not what we want to do. But it is, in fact, one of the problems of aggregating youth together. It makes the less risky ones more risky. Next slide. All right. One of the recent cases I was involved in was what happens when youth are labeled and they're in the process of finding out who they are. And the well-intentioned idea of creating a registry and a public notification process, Megan's Law, might be appropriate for adults, and I'm not 100% sure about that, but it definitely has very negative effects on youth. So if you get a youngster who's engaged in a behavior, and it could be, in fact, a relatively low-risk type of behavior, but we label them a sex offender, and then they figure out who they are, and that's actually has a very negative consequence in their long-term adjustment to being an adult. And we want to provide them with positive role modeling, including adults who have a moral compass, who have some idea of what's right and wrong. Certainly the notion of masculinity has been discussed a lot recently, and healthy masculinity, can we be men and treat each other with respect, treat women with respect, treat human beings with respect. And if we learn how to do that, we'll do a lot better in the world. But the whole notion of healthy masculinity is in some tension and in some flux right now. And I think it's actually a good flux, but it still does mean that we have to really kind of rethink some of this stuff. And certainly positive sexuality. What kind of messages are we encouraging with our youth? And they're going to be sexual. I think this is kind of a given, although most parents wish that wasn't the case. But they're going to be sexual, and it's really good if they can do that in a healthy kind of way, and certainly giving them the tools, i.e. Establishing consent. How do you establish consent? Joked recently that the whole courtship process, the process of coupling off and finding who we're attracted to, is incredibly complicated, and there are no classes for it. We don't learn that from our parents, we don't learn it from anybody, and consequently the kind of trial and error methods that a lot of youth use in trying to figure out how to be, adult sexual people, which is what they're intending to be, often is very difficult, and they don't do a good job at it at times, and sometimes they end up getting our attention and upsetting the adults in their life. And certainly giving them age-appropriate socialization skills, the ability to kind of interact, develop friendships, develop some intimacy, connection, the kinds of things that we really like and see as healthy adult socialization skills. Youth are still learning that. We give them credit for that learning process. The takeaway, juveniles who engage in sexually inappropriate behavior are unlikely, by and large, to continue this behavior into adulthood. I mean, it's a reasonable concern and we need to intervene on whatever level, but the fears that these are budding, sexual predators for the future as adults is just simply not the case. And I think there's a lot more worry about that than is appropriate, but I can understand the concern. Most youth can be treated safely in the community. By and large, the youth can be treated safely in the community, with a few exceptions, only the most. Offensive behavior patterns are malleable. That means they can change, and they greatly depend on the environment. If they have a healthy environment and healthy peers, they're going to be much less likely to engage in that behavior than if their peer group is in fact other youth who are engaging in troublesome behavior. And treatment is usually helpful in the modification of these behaviors. Treatment does work. It's helpful. It's helpful for these youth to have a care and concerned adult taking interest in their welfare. And sometimes that's really as therapeutic as it can get, is to have a very caring, healthy adult to be around. So that's my quick presentation, obviously not in depth in what goes on in treatment, but that'll give you some ideas.
Thank you, Dr. Bosley. At this point, we're ready to take questions from our audience. Do we have any questions? If you haven't done so already and you have a question, please type it in now so that we can take these last few minutes and answer any questions that come in. And while we're waiting for questions, one question that I was thinking of when you were speaking, Dr. Bosley, and also Dr. Hiscox, is what is the availability of treatment resources for these youth? Can either of you speak to that?
I think it's there's not enough providers that are specialized, who have received specialized training and are able to work with the population. And one of the reasons I think that it is that when a therapist is starting their career, there's some fear about working with forensic populations in general, including sexually abusive youth. So therapists are likely to go in another direction. Now, with that said, with the resources that we do have, and New Jersey ATSA, I think, does an excellent job of trying to get the training to provide adequate training and so forth. And if they're taking part in those sort of things, they're very well trained and they know what they're doing.
Certainly there's a problem with the dearth of skilled providers doing this kind of work. I know that the New Jersey Bar Association has just made a recommendation that some type of treatment be made available in all counties, and that's an official recommendation for the state to establish. How that's going to be established, I think, is greatly in question. But both of us kind of note that there are certain areas where the therapists seem to decide to live and decide to work, and so there are larger areas down south that it's pretty hard to find a provider who's trained in this very specialized area. And I'll underline what Sean said about doing this kind of work. It's a high liability, not real lucrative, and so a lot of therapists go, oh yeah, I want to be sued and be drugged into court for something one of my clients does and not make much money. How does that make sense? So I think it's a reasonable kind of thing, although I think the state could do better by encouraging providers and doing the training. I think New Jersey ATSA's efforts are well taken, because it does provide an opportunity for clinicians to learn more about this specific field. But it is an area where if the providers don't see much reason to be doing this, if it's not it's not either held in high esteem or lucrative, then the providers are going to shy away from it, which is, I think, what has happened. And this is interesting because I think in contrast to the adult providers, there are quite a few more adult providers of this kind of service in the state of New Jersey. New Jersey is kind of a hotbed of, good provision, good service provision for adult offenders. It's just much less so for sexually abusive youth. And at one time, the Juvenile Justice Commission had a training process where they had offered training for clinicians who agreed to provide ongoing services for sexually abusive youth, and they got a year-long training for free if they were willing to do that. And the Juvenile Justice Commission funded this training. I was one of the trainers, that's why I know that it occurred. And the long term is a lot of those people finished the training, continued working for a period of time, and are now working in the adult system. So, which is a little bit of a comment, so.
Thank you. Well, it looks like we don't have any questions from our audience. Are there any final comments from anyone in the room? Okay. Well, thank you again to Ms. Cramner, Mr. Farrell, Dr. Hiscox, and Dr. Bosley. This concludes the third in the series of 5 webinars. The recorded version will be uploaded within 2 weeks to the njatsa.org website. Our next webinar will be on January the 14th at 10 a.m. and will focus on the supervision of adult offenders on both parole and probation. Thank you for listening and have a great day.